see more of you in Question Time today. Thanks so much for your time.
Laura.
Now, the government is keeping out of China's latest move to enact a constitutional change which allows the country's president to keep ruling. Xi Jinping is set to become the most powerful leader since Mao, now that he's allowed to serve past his second term in office. Earlier, I spoke to the former Foreign Minister, Bob Carr, to ask him how it could impact our relationship with China.
I think many Chinese would be disappointed. They knew that they lived under an authoritarian system of government, but there was some sense in which they accepted those constraints in return for the rising living standards that all Chinese have enjoyed, quite dramatic rises in living standards. But I detect that there are deep concerns in China by the fact that this element of restraint on Chinese governance has been removed from the constitution. Because even with all its authoritarian characteristics, effectively one-party rule, China did say from the early 1980s that people enjoying the very considerable powers of the presidency would be limited to 2 5-year terms. Now that restraint is gone, and many Chinese would see that as being the removal of one element that provided a check or a balance in what is, by any test, an authoritarian constitution.
What do you think is the motivation behind Xi Jinping lifting this restriction? Is it a nervousness on his part that he is not as powerful as he thinks he is or wants to be?
Well, I think there's a respectable and a less respectable explanation. The respectable explanation is that China is pulling off an astonishing economic transformation. It's becoming a 70% middle-class country. It's lifting 850 million people into middle-income status between 2012 and 2030. No country in history has done anything remotely like this when it comes to the rapidity and the scale of changing the Chinese economy into one based on services and consumption. They're succeeding, but it's a very challenging transition. So the respectable explanation from Chinese leaders talking to their Americans interlocutors, for example, would be that we need this to complete China's opening up, the agenda that Deng Xiaoping laid down. On the other hand, a less respectable explanation is that this president has been eliminating factional rivals in China. He's used the device of a campaign against corruption to do that. He's probably succeeded beyond his own expectations and succeeded earlier than he ever imagined he might. But that makes someone who's been so brutal in the use of power have to consider what futures he's going to have when he gives up power and is there not holding the presidency. It's complicated. He would manage to continue to hold the chairmanship of the Military Commission and even to be party secretary, but he's calculated that the risk might be too great, having done what he's done in eliminating factional rivals.
Also, for us here in Australia, how concerning is it, given that Xi Jinping essentially wants to unwind the Deng Xiaoping restrictions, which would in some ways paint Mao as a golden era within China? Do you think Xi Jinping has that view? Does he want to return to something of the sorts?
No, there's no notion that Mao's rule was a golden age. I think it's too close to many Chinese to enable them to face up to the horrors of the Cultural Revolution. Don't forget, this president suffered as a young man during the Cultural Revolution, and so did his father. His colleagues on the 7-man standing committee of the Politburo included, I think still includes, after the changes we saw at the party congress in October, people who in their family history had suffered under Mao. They're not open in criticism of Mao. The official party line is that Mao was 70% right, 30% wrong, a formula like that. But there's no hankering for a return to the ideological purity and the persecution of opponents that that form the terrible inhumanity of the Cultural Revolution, in which millions of people died. China's not going back to that. But for some Chinese, the concept of an uncapped term of office has got at least one reminder of Mao's rule and what they would say in the privacy of their own homes, Mao's misrule.
Just finally, can I ask you about Admiral Harry Harris and what you think he might bring to the role as the next ambassador to Australia from the United States? He's seen as quite hawkish when it comes to China. We've seen the views of Tillerson and others in the United States. Is it becoming more difficult for Australia to balance the two relationships between China and the United States? And how will Harry Harris either enhance that or make it more difficult?
Well, I wish him well, as I've wished well every US ambassador in my time, and I've known them all. But I think he's going to be diplomatic to know that he can't strut the stage in Australia and read Australia lectures on how we ought to run our China policy past the US embassy. We are entitled, as France, as the UK, as Germany, American allies are entitled to our own pragmatic, national interest-based China policy. And the fact is, Washington, as Malcolm Turnbull pointed out a few years ago, doesn't buy our iron ore. Washington is not sending a million and a half tourists here every year, nor is it providing the students who pay full fees at Australian universities. China is, whether we like it or not, the guarantor of Australia's prosperity over the next 20 years as it hauls 850 million more people out of poverty. That's our market. That's the guarantee of the living standards of every Australian household. And I suspect that Harry Harris will be cautious about giving the impression that he's here to recruit Australia to taking on China militarily and strategically. His role is diplomat, no longer the commander of the US Pacific.
But we saw from President Donald Trump during Malcolm Turnbull's visit to Washington that he does want to see Australia take part in freedom of navigation exercises. How would that be viewed in China?
Well, you've got to define your terms. We run patrols through what the Chinese have described pretty casually as their 9-dash lines. That is through the general area of the South China Sea. What we don't do is what the Americans have been doing, run freedom of navigation patrols within the 12 nautical mile radius of artificial Chinese structures. We haven't done it. No other US ally has done it. No other US ally has announced they are going to do it. And I think the Prime Minister has made it pretty clear in coded language, as has Julie Bishop, that we're going to make our own decision about this. If Harry Harris pushed too hard on that front, and I don't think he's naive enough to do it, he's going to risk the high likelihood of being told by Australia, that's not our role. We will make our point to the Chinese about the South China Sea using diplomatic means, but not taking them on militarily. I think that's the best reading of Australia's interests, and it seems to be what Julie Bishop said in a statement earlier today.
Bob Carr, thank you so much for your time today.
Laura, my pleasure.